I've been back with ODOT for 23 years. So Forest Service was a long time ago, but during that time I probably spent, I don't know, more than 10 years working in pavements. So in some respects it was a real eye-opener to go from pavements to bridges. But you know, it was really interesting to look at the data sources that are in the bridge section and have an opportunity to really look at it and see what kind of story it tells. So the dollars part of this, which is, you're right, Mark, it was part of looking at making a case for bridge investment, but Oregon really is on the cusp of trying to make a decision around a transportation package. So our legislature is in session right now, and so the information I'm going to present today was provided to them as part of a study to fund our infrastructure. And fortunately, thanks to your diligent efforts, we've got information that really can provide an objective approach to looking at it, and so they can be confident that, you know, while we'll make assumptions, but we've got some good data. So I like this quote. We want to turn data into information and then get some insight into it. I think it's really useful, and there's so much there. So I was really excited to have it. I think I found my inner nerd by being able to come over and do a lot of analysis. So this is another one. You know, you can do a lot with data, and I'm sure all of you have worked some with statistics and know that you can make it say anything you want, and you can torture it and everything too. I tried to be really careful about that. Every time we would do some analysis, we step back and look and say, does this make sense? As a pavements engineer, I would talk to bridge engineers too and try and get their input to make sure that we truly weren't torturing the data. So what I'd like to do today is kind of set the stage. I'll give you the background for where our bridge system is based on the data that you provided. Talk a little bit about the forecasting methodology that we've used to provide some input into where we're headed, and that would be including the results of the forecasting. So how dire is dire? Unfortunately, that's kind of the punchline. And then look at overall as a state, what happens when our bridges start to decline. It gets pretty serious pretty fast. So I do have to offer a disclaimer. One is that, well, another disclaimer, that this is the 50,000-foot view of the data. So I'm looking from a system. We haven't gotten to the point where we're going to be looking bridge by bridge, but certainly we're taking the condition information of all the bridges, putting it together, and getting an overall system condition approach. So with that, a little bit about the background. So I mentioned that we supported the legislative session, and this is a picture that came out of one of the presentations they did. They get it. You know, bridges are indispensable. And so they're working on this arduous task of trying to figure out how do we get some money and address more than just bridges. So that's the challenge. They've got roads and bridges, and we've got seismic issues. They've got traffic congestion. I'm sure you've been driving around Portland, so you know somewhere we're going to have to fund that. Eventually, maybe, or you'll be walking, I'm not sure. We've got multimodal freight issues, transit. And then the other piece that is kind of looming with the Oregon DOT is there's some accountability issues. So they actually are looking at that within their group. There's been a study done from an independent consultant looking at how ODOT manages its money and its programs. And so there's going to be a piece of that attached to the legislation. So it's an important committee, and they've been very forthright coming with trying to be transparent. So all of their meetings are online, so you can go watch the video and see who's outspoken and who's not. And then they have work groups, and the work groups unfortunately aren't videotaped, but they do report back. So I've been able to track kind of the progress to some degree as to what they've been thinking about. So that first picture was the Fremont Bridge. This is also the Fremont Bridge. And I learned as a pavements engineer that bridges aren't always what they seem when you drive over them at 55 or 65 miles an hour, and sometimes you get below them, and it's too bad we couldn't take all our legislatures and have them walk under a few of our bridges. I think they would get another story. But I do sense that they get it. Everything that I've been watching, they went and they did a statewide tour, And the report back from the statewide tours with some of the stakeholders was that, yes, you need to take care of what we have. So I have every confidence that there's going to be some money for our infrastructure and preservation. It's just going to be a matter of how do you balance that with all of the needs. So making a case for it, and again, this is looking at the big picture, kind of supporting our need, is that no one can argue our bridges are older. And they continue to get older, and once you get older, just like our bodies, they deteriorate. And so unfortunately, they're not going to get any younger, and the largest group you can see are those that were built from 50 to 74, 40 to 70 years old now. In another 20 years, 60 to 90. I mean, those are significant. They need work. And so breaking those out even further, we have the grand old set called the interstate era bridges, which everybody in the country has, and they're going to be problematic. In Oregon, we have more than 10,000. We don't have that many bridges. We have 1,000 that were built during the interstate era, and our system is about 2,740 bridges, so maybe a third of our bridges are interstate era bridges. So I don't know about you all, but what I've read during the Eisenhower administration, they were quick to fund, and we can build these interstates, and we can, improve the economy of the state and move missiles. But they didn't think about what are we going to do in the future? How do we maintain the system? And so here we are, the country's kind of strapped with this, and we need to determine what are we going to do. And if you're interested, there's a great book. I don't know if anyone's read Big Roads. Anyone read that? It's a great history of the interstate. It talks about a lot of leaders that promoted building roads all the way back from what color of signs are we going to use? How do we provide consistency across the nation so that when you travel from one side to the next, you have some familiarity. So Big Roads is the name of it. Great. So one of the things about our interstate era bridges is that they were built somewhat quickly, and a lot of them have things like thin decks that tend to break up, and they fall apart, they crack, they have reduced load capacity. So not only are these bridges getting older, but they were built with no reserve capacity. So we need to figure out what we're going to do with these. Otherwise, my first thought when I saw this picture and I heard about this failure, which happened to be on our Interstate in 84 near Troutdale, for those of you who are familiar with the area, was, wow, those poor maintenance guys, they had to go out there on a weekend to fix it. But the other piece of it is, think of the traffic backup. You think about as our bridges age, we're going to have significant impact to mobility. So you might want to think about that bike or walking further. I don't know, but it's not going to get any better. The other thing about these interstate era bridges I want to mention too is earthquake susceptibility. So we've done a lot of work around projecting what our needs for earthquakes, and these bridges have no capacity, and they're going to be unstable during an earthquake. So where are we? So we're actually, if you look at it from a big picture, we're not too bad. So you can see we've got, some good bridges, some fair bridges at an NBI of 6. And then we have these fair at an NBI of 5. So, that's 20% of our system. It's doing pretty good. But those 5s, not all of them are the same, right? Some of those 5s have been 5s for 15 years. So they run the risk of having some needs if they go poor. NBI is kind of an indicator. It's not a great tell-all that tells you what the needs are, but you can see we call these 5s cusp bridges. So they're the ones we're kind of nervous about. And unfortunately, you can see we're losing ground. If you were going to manage your bridge system, you're going to want sort of a relatively even distribution of bridge conditions. And what this shows is we're losing ground on the good bridges. We're doing pretty good on the poor bridges for different reasons I'll talk about a little bit. But, if things continue like this, we're going to be left with fair bridges, and those are the ones that really do need some work. And then with limited funding, we're going to have to make some hard decisions. So one of the reasons we're losing ground on the good bridges is that we're only replacing about 3 bridges, and this is based on condition a year, when we really should be replacing 27. if you think about it, the service life of a bridge, let's say we can get 100 years out of it, and we have 2,700 bridges in our system, that means every year we should be replacing 27 bridges, right? 1%. Well, we get a whopping 3, and that's in a good year. And part of that is because our bridge program is funded at $85 million. So, you know, it sounds like a lot of money, but in today's economy, it doesn't go very far. And I think it's interesting to look at maintenance gets $200 million, and you'd like to think that goes all at infrastructure, but, you know, they're cleaning ditches, they're doing incident response, so if there's a crash, they have to go out and do traffic control. So it doesn't all reflect in the condition of our system. So unfortunately, there's just, again, not that much money to go around. And if you break it down by how we spend it in our program, so we have $10 million that we provide for addressing major bridge maintenance. So when the ODOT bridge inspectors look at bridges, the information goes into the inspection report, and information comes back in some cases to our major bridge maintenance engineer, and so he can identify what needs are on some bridges. And then also there are maintenance crews, bridge crews, that submit project ideas that can be funded with major bridge maintenance dollars. So these are projects that are beyond what a district could do with their own funding. So typically things that are, you know, less than $250,000, but more than what their budget allows. In some cases, they want to use this money, you know, they get bridge money to do their bridge work. They can use their other maintenance money to pave, which is fine if you're a pavements engineer, but not so good if you're a bridge engineer. But again, it's $10 million that goes to bridges and keeps them operating. We also have a lot of steel bridges in Oregon. We spend about $30 million a year doing painting and cathodic protection. So a lot of these are iconic bridges. So think about the Astoria Megler Bridge that crosses the Columbia out of Astoria, and then we have the Yaquina Bay Bridge and several other McCulloch bridges that need work. But in all, we have 330 painted bridges in Oregon. And so those are really at risk if we don't continue to do a painting program, because they're going to corrode, and that means they're going to cost more to repair. So we try and keep up on that. We're still playing catch up with some other deferred maintenance on that program, but we do spend a fair amount, which leaves us $45 million a year to spend on major rehabilitation projects and replacements. So it doesn't go very far. And if you look at it by the numbers, so we might get a couple of hundred bridges with the major bridge maintenance, but those could be anywhere from $10,000 to $250,000. They could be deck seals. We could be looking at bridge joints, just minor repairs that, again, the maintenance can't afford on their own. And then major rehab, paint, maybe 25 projects a year, and then replace 2 to 3 projects. So again, not a whole lot. And if you look at it in terms of percentages, you know, you can kind of get a sense. We call this our Pac-Man chart, because you can see, you know, 92% of our bridges aren't getting any attention in a year, which, you know, it's a whole lot. And so, unfortunately, we just aren't keeping up. So one of the things I thought I should bring up is past funding that we've done. And this has a kind of a good and bad story. And I guess if I was a true bridge person, I couldn't tell about the bad, but I'll go ahead and tell you the good and the bad. So, you know, this was good. It was $1.3 billion that we spent. We started in 2003. It was a big program over 10 years. And they were able to replace 149 bridges, pretty good. 122 were repaired. But in total, that's 271, or 10% of our bridges in 10 years. So, you know, it helped, but it didn't shift the tide, shall I say. And the other thing is, though, this money was all bonded, so we're still paying that back. So if you look at kind of how it all comes together, you can see pre-OTIA funding. So you can see this is a year on the bottom. And then the vertical axis is kind of the percentage of our bridges that are in good, fair, poor condition. And you can see before OTIA, you know, we had a steady funding, and I guess I don't have I do have the dollar amounts, about 125 million, and then post now, this shows a little bit more than 100, but that's because we have some other funds coming in. But we're not at the pre-OTIA funding level even, because we're paying off those bonds. And then you can see that what the OTIA money did is it didn't stop the decline, it just slowed the decline. So even with that big influx of money, we aren't able to change, again, where things are headed. Which brings us to kind of forecasting the conditions of our bridges. So this is an interesting bridge because this is the Astoria Megler Bridge that I talked about, one of our iconic bridges that we're painting, and you can see it's got a project on it right now, so you can see the cover. But so the estimate on this bridge is it costs an annualized cost of $5 million a year to paint it. So for the rest of its life, we're going to be spending $5 million a year on it. So, for our bridge program, that's significant. But there's no way we're not going to paint it because it's a critical bridge. So forecasting, modeling is a really hot topic, and maybe it's been a hot topic for a while, but these are three of the papers I just pulled out from the recent Transportation Research Board meeting, so 2017, all talking about deterioration, how to make predictions, how to look at element condition changes. So there's a whole bunch of people looking at this. Also, we've been approached by the Long-Term Bridge Performance Program to incorporate our data into some of their methodology. So what we've done is fairly basic, and they're going to look at fine-tuning it so we can actually drill down and get more specific bridge treatments and actually look bridge by bridge rather than system level. So we've got further to go, but for the time being, I think we've done some fair projections. So the data used, so back to your role in this, the data used to forecast bridge conditions is the MBI, so deck, super, and sub, and we've got data back to 1983, so that's really useful. And then we also look at health index calculations. So I don't know if any of you have investigated that, but it's a way to look at the weighted average of the different elements and their role in the condition of the bridge. So I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But first, in terms of the NBI, so one of the things that I guess bridge planners have talked about is dwell time. So how long does a bridge stay at 8? How long does it stay at 7? How long does it stay at 6? And so we look at that for each of the components, deck, super, and sub. And so we get an idea of how fast or how slow that decline is going to be in conditions. So I purposely didn't put the dwell time at 5 because one is we don't have a lot of bridges that go from 5 to 4 because we put some investment in them. We use major bridge maintenance dollars to keep them at a 5, or those are the bridges we target for rehab. So it's not, that is a little bit more tricky, and we had to make some assumptions about the dwell time around 5. But looking at the historical data, deck, super, and sub, and where we're at, so what we've done is we decided that typically a bridge deck stays at one rating for 12 years. So it goes from an 8 to a 7 in 12 years, 7 to 6, another 12, and then 12. So it'll take 36 years to get from an 8 to a 8, 7, 6 to a 5, and then 16 years for super and sub. So we call it our 12, 16, 16 model. So that accounts for the MBI deterioration. So the problem, though, that I saw coming in when they ask us to identify a prioritized list of bridges is if we just look at NBI, we still have, our worst bridges needing work we have 544 bridges that are fair. So it's not descriptive enough to tell us what are those good 5s, what are the bad 5s, where should we focus our attention? So that's why I started investigating the health index. And so I kind of like this picture because it shows you that you can look at different elements, kind of group them together, and get a sense of what that component condition is. And so you can see for the substructure, we've got the piles, pile cap and footing, piers and columns. So you can put all those conditions together and get an idea of the health. Now, they're not all equally contributing, right? So there has to be some weighting factors. So that's why I say it's a weighted average of the condition. So I attempted here, and I know it's late in the afternoon to try and feed you a lot of numbers, but I wanted to show you an example of what we did for the deck. So you can see we've got 3 elements that are associated with this particular deck, and they're all in square feet. You know, sometimes you're mixing square feet with lineal feet or each, so you have to figure out what the weighting factor is. And they do have different weighting factors here. So you can see the deck and the top flange both have a weighting factor of 6, and then the slab has a weighting factor of 9. So this is published data. It's subject to, you know, I'm sure the states could do some work with it, but I went with what we had. And then you take the element quantity and the condition state for each of those, and you multiply those, and you get an HI for the element. So you can see that in the purple section. And you can see the HI for the element is the quantity in condition state 1, and then you only take 2/3 of the value in condition state 2 and 1/3 in condition state 4. If you haven't, or I'm sorry, 3. If you have anything in condition state 4, it doesn't get any credit because that's pretty bad condition. So if you look at big picture, so if you had everything in condition state 1, you'd have a health index of 100. And if you had everything in condition state 3, you'd have a health index of 33%. So you can see that's kind of the split. All right, so everybody asks, well, if you're looking at health index and MBI, how do they compare? And this sort of supports the national findings too. There really is no comparison, but it supports my concern that all 5s are not equal. So if you look at the original MBI on the bottom, which runs from 4 to 8, and the comparison with the deck health index on the left, and then each dot represents a bridge. So you can see the 5s especially are all over the place. So we got some 5s with a health index of 100 and some much lower at barely over 30. So that's why it was important, I think, when we were doing our modeling, we wanted to be able to differentiate, you know, good from bad to worse, kind of. So we put all this together, and I'll spare you all the details, especially at this late hour, but we put them all together, and so we have NBI and we have HI, and we can put them into a function, give them some weighting, and we can use that to kind of multiply it by design life to give us a surrogate indication of the condition. All right, so now we get into forecasting results. I like this picture because they look so happy, you know? It looks to me like hard work, but yeah, they are happy. So maybe happier than sitting at a desk. That's probably what the concern was. All right, so we got to prioritize. So we know we don't have enough money to do the whole system. So what we're going to do, we know conditions. We've looked at those. So we've got the MBI, low capacity, but also we need to look at route. Interstates are not the same as some of the routes where we get 100 vehicles a day. So we had to split those out. So we have in Oregon what we call fix-it routes, and so this has been it's been vetted from different stakeholders. Primarily, it's the interstate routes and primary freight routes, and then what we also did is put in some seismic routes. But so you can see these are critical fix-it routes, and you can see priorities from back in June when we were looking at this. These change now and then because we give results to management and say, oh, well, I think we want to get 205 rather than this section of I-84 over on Ontario. So we switched things around, but at least it gave us some ability to spend money where we thought it would be of best value. So looking at that, given our current funding levels, you can see things are pretty bleak. So I got to put another disclaimer in here too is, you know, the good thing about it being a planner, unlike a designer, is you can make assumptions and people can throw, you know, they can throw rocks at your assumptions, but as long as you followed a reasonable thought process, you know, okay, this is what I got, you did it a different way, you get a different thing. So that disclaimer is good. The other thing is nobody's going to be around in 2056 to say, what were you thinking? So, you know, it's actually pretty fun. I got to tell you, it's a great job. So you can see, though, you know, we've got a lot of potential to have some poor bridges coming up. So that's the message, that's the story we're trying to tell with this data. So what if they gave us more money? So this is back to the legislature. So Oregon has not had a gas tax increase since 2009, and that was the only one in 24 years. So, I think it's realistic to think that that's probably what's going to happen. How much, again, is a question. So the legislature gave us, not the legislature, but the steering committee gave us kind of 4 things to look at. And I don't know, hopefully you can see this. The one in the top level, scenario 1 is just our current information. Scenario 2 is a slight increase of 14 cents. And then we go up from there. The last one, scenario 4, is crazy. They said, if you had crazy amount of money, what would it take to keep your bridges? So we assessed all those, and in the end, you can see either way, we're going to lose ground. It's just a matter of we're not going to be able to keep up. And in that not keeping up, you can see we're going to have to target priority routes, and some are going to get left out. And unfortunately, the less money we get, the less money, obviously, the fewer routes we're going to do. So the other piece, there's seismic money too. So on the table with the legislature is we're trying to get some money to address retrofits and replacements to address seismic, and that's a whopping $5 billion. It's not going to happen in the 20 years, but they do want to get through some of the key corridors in the valley. All right, so this is a term you're going to hear more and more of. It's disinvestment. Things are declining. It's how do we manage that decline? All right, so I want to just rush through I shouldn't say rush. I just want to close with some of these things. So our data was put into another statewide model that was done to look at the overall economic impacts to Oregon. So, bridges are bad, you're going to have impact to traffic, but you're going to have impact on the economy because you're prohibiting freight movement. So this information was put into a Rough Roads Ahead report, which was based on weight restricting bridges. And so you can see we're going to have a lot of poor bridges, and some of those are interstate bridges. And so you can see the top bar of these for the different scenarios has some interstate bridges. So regardless of what scenario we go with, we're going to have potential for weight restricting some of our interstate bridges. So some of the other smaller bridges, maybe we can get around because we can use smaller amounts of money. We can use the major bridge maintenance money to keep that from being posted. But either way, we're going to have some issues in the future. And of course, economic issues, the hit on the gross domestic product could be anywhere, if we don't do anything, from $600 billion to a significant increase is still going to result in a couple hundred billion dollar economic impact, which translates into jobs. New projections are anywhere from 75,000 to 100,000 jobs. So it's pretty significant if we just try and not ignore it, or try to ignore it. So what's next? I had to put this in. There actually is a Senate Bill 798 right now that's passed, I think, the committee, that would establish a state transportation donation fund, which would appropriate money to where you want it to go. Come on, you could paint, you could fill a pothole on one of the bridge decks. Unfortunately, even if that happens, it's not going to be enough. So the committee talked about potentially 11 cents, and this has got the disclaimer. Several of the work group members suggested it, but there was no agreement. So this was a few weeks ago. They're still discussing it. 9 to 11 cents. But ODOT, I think we all get it. Even at 11 cents, this is a great quote. Oregon's bridges will not get fixed. They just won't fall apart as fast. So unfortunately, it's that disinvestment kind of thing. And it goes back to, too, there's not enough money to address all the needs. So I guess I'm glad I'm not an elected official trying to decide where we put our emphasis and how do we pay for it. So stay tuned. So I like this quote, so we can't ignore it. I hope I built a case based on the data you've provided and we've collected for the last 30 years that the fact is things are declining. We need to manage that. And how are we going to do it?